My name is Renee. I'm 28 years old, and I'm standing in a Connecticut courtroom watching my parents demand everything I own through a lawsuit. They claim I owe them for raising me, for giving me life itself. The judge asks the bailiff to read their itemized list of demands. First items seem normal enough: my car savings account, grandmother's jewelry. Then the bailiff's voice falters as he continues reading. Item 47, birthday cards from deceased grandmother, estimated value $0. Item 48, childhood teddy bear named Mr. Button's, condition poor, value $0. My parents' lawyer shifts uncomfortably in his expensive suit as I watch my mother's perfectly manicured hands grip her designer purse. I remember the real reason they want these worthless items and why they'll stop at nothing to get them. Before I share what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you've ever dealt with toxic family members who put money before love, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories like mine. Trust me, what the bailiff discovered on that list will shock you as much as it shocked everyone in that courtroom. Let's dive into how I ended up here, facing off against the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Growing up in Westport, Connecticut, everyone thought I had the perfect life. My father, Richard, was a successful investment banker at one of Manhattan's most prestigious firms, while my mother, Diane, spent her days organizing charity galas and maintaining her position as queen bee of the country club social scene. Our colonial home had 6 bedrooms, a pool house, and manicured gardens that were featured in Connecticut Living magazine. I attended Greenwood Prep, where annual tuition cost more than most people's yearly salary. On paper, I was living the American dream, but behind the pristine white doors of our picture-perfect home, love came with a price tag. Literally. From the day I was born, my parents kept leather-bound ledgers tracking every single expense related to raising me. I'm not talking about casual budget tracking that responsible parents might do. I mean obsessive itemized documentation of every diaper, every ounce of formula, every outfit, every toy. They saved receipts for everything and filed them in color-coded folders in my father's home office. When I was 7, I accidentally discovered these ledgers while looking for coloring paper. My mother found me crying over pages that reduced my existence to dollar signs and cents. She simply took the books away and told me that good investments required careful tracking. The emotional manipulation started early. Good grades earned me calculated affection, usually in the form of material rewards that were naturally documented in the ledgers. When I brought home my first report card with straight A's, my parents took me to FIO Schwartz and let me pick out any toy I wanted. But as my father wrote the check, he made sure I understood that this reward came with expectations. "We invest in success, Renee," he said, ruffling my hair with the same hand that signed away $300 for a dollhouse I'd play with twice. By high school, I had internalized their system completely. I threw myself into academics, not because I loved learning, but because achievement was the only currency that purchased their approval. I joined debate team model UN student government and National Honor Society. My schedule was packed with AP classes and SAT prep courses. When I became valedictorian of my graduating class, my mother actually smiled at me without checking her Botox in the mirror first. That smile felt like winning the lottery, even though I later found out they'd already calculated the return on investment my academic success would bring through college admissions. The first crack in our family facade appeared during my senior year at Yale. Yes, I got into Yale, but that itself had been a source of conflict because my mother had her heart set on Harvard, her alma mater. She literally didn't speak to me for a week after I chose Yale, treating my decision as a personal betrayal rather than an 18-year-old picking the school that felt right for her. But the real earthquake hit when I met Jake Martinez in my environmental economics class. Jake was everything my parents had trained me to avoid. He came from a working-class family in New Haven, was at Yale on a full scholarship, and was studying to become of all things a plumber. Not a hedge fund manager or corporate lawyer, but someone who worked with his hands. When I invited him to Thanksgiving dinner my senior year, I watched my parents' faces cycle through shock, disgust, and finally cold calculation as they assessed this unexpected variable in their investment portfolio. My mother pulled me aside while Jake helped clear dishes, her voice dripping with false concern. "Darling, you must be careful about people who might take advantage of your position." By position, she meant money. The irony of my parents warning me about gold diggers while they kept ledgers documenting my cost would have been funny if it wasn't so twisted. When I told her Jake had never asked me for anything and actually insisted on paying for our dates despite having less money, she laughed. "They all say that at first, sweetheart. Your father was the same way until he realized what our family could offer him." The ultimatum came 2 weeks before graduation. My parents sat me down in my father's office surrounded by those damned ledgers and presented me with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Break up with Jake immediately, or lose all financial support. They had already calculated what they called my total investment cost, up to that point, $1.3 million, including private school college tuition, living expenses, vacations, and even a percentage of the family home's mortgage allocated to my childhood bedroom. "We're not asking for repayment," my father said, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "We're simply protecting our investment from depreciation." I looked at these two people who had given me life but never really given me love, and for the first time in 22 years I found my voice. "I choose Jake," I said. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face went through so many expressions that her Botox finally got a workout. My father simply closed the ledger in front of him with the same finality he probably used when terminating underperforming employees. They gave me 24 hours to pack my belongings, though they insisted on reviewing each item to ensure I only took things that were mine. My childhood teddy bear Mr. Buttons made the cut because it had been a gift from Grandmother Rose. The laptop they'd given me for college stayed behind because it was technically on loan. As I loaded my permitted possessions into Jake's beat-up Honda Civic, my mother stood in the doorway like a marble statue, beautiful and cold. "You'll be back," she said. "And when you are, the terms will be much less favorable." The first months after leaving my parents' house tested every ounce of strength I thought I had, and discovered reserves I didn't know existed. Jake and I moved into a cramped studio apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant in East Haven. The smell of pho permanently embedded itself in our clothes, but after growing up in a sterile mansion that smelled like expensive candles and disappointment, I found the aroma comforting. While Jake finished his trade school certification, I took any job that would hire someone with an Ivy League degree, but zero practical experience. My days blurred into a marathon of survival. Mornings started at 4:30 when I caught the bus to my opening shift at a local bakery, where I learned that burns from industrial ovens hurt like hell, and that decorating wedding cakes for happy couples while your own family had disowned you required a special kind of emotional fortitude. After 8 hours of fondant and frosting, I rushed to my afternoon tutoring gigs, helping privileged high schoolers with their SAT prep, while trying not to think about how their parents probably loved them regardless of their test scores. Evenings meant waitressing at an upscale restaurant where cruel irony alert my parents' country club friends occasionally dined. The first time one of my mother's tennis partners walked in and recognized me carrying a tray of martinis, the gossip spread through Westport's social circles faster than a wildfire in August. My mother, ever the master of spin, crafted a narrative that painted me as a rebellious child going through a phase destroyed by the influence of that boy. She told anyone who would listen that I was probably on drugs, that Jake had isolated me from my loving family, that they were simply waiting for me to hit rock bottom and come crawling back. Extended family members who had once doted on me suddenly became strangers. My cousin Whitney, who I'd grown up considering a sister, blocked me on social media after my aunt told her I was contagious with poor decisions. Birthday cards stopped arriving. Christmas invitations were rescinded. The family WhatsApp group I'd been part of since high school went silent, or rather I discovered I'd been quietly removed when my uncle's wife accidentally texted me thinking I was someone else. But while my blood family abandoned me, I was building something real with Jake. He'd come home exhausted from plumbing apprenticeship, covered in things I didn't want to identify, and still insist on cooking dinner, because he knew I'd been on my feet for 16 hours. When I cried from exhaustion and the weight of losing everyone I'd grown up with, he held me and reminded me that we were creating something better than what I'd left behind. "Your parents gave you things," he said one night as we shared ramen on our makeshift dinner table made from a door and 2 sawhorses. "We're building a life." 2 years into our new existence, Jake's natural talent and incredible work ethic paid off when he got his master plumber license and started his own business. I'll never forget the day he came home with the official paperwork, grinning like he'd won the lottery. We celebrated with champagne that cost less than what my mother used to spend on a single lunch, but it tasted like victory. Martinez Plumbing started with just Jake and a borrowed van, but his reputation for honest work and fair prices spread quickly through the Hispanic community in New Haven and then beyond. Around the same time, I discovered I had inherited my grandmother Rose's creative gene, though it had been suppressed under years of academic pressure. What started as making jewelry from clearance beads and YouTube tutorials to decompress from my multiple jobs evolved into an actual business. I named it Rose Gold Designs, in honor of the one family member who had shown me unconditional love. My pieces, inspired by the intersection of my privileged past and working-class present, resonated with women who understood reinvention. As our small businesses grew, so did our savings account. Every dollar felt like a tiny victory against my parents' prediction that I'd fail without them. Jake proposed to me on our 3rd anniversary of that awful ultimatum day, getting down on one knee in our tiny apartment with a ring he'd bought from a pawn shop. It wasn't the 2-carat diamond my Greenwood prep classmates would have expected, but it was purchased with love instead of calculated investment potential, which made it priceless. That's when Grandmother Rose reappeared in my life like a guardian angel in Chanel's suit. She showed up at my jewelry booth at a craft fair, having tracked me down through what she called detective work, but what probably involved bribing my parents' housekeeper. Seeing her lined face and kind eyes after 3 years of family exile broke something open inside me. I sobbed into her vintage Hermes scarf while customers politely pretended not to notice. "I never approved of how your parents treated you," Rose said over tea at a nearby cafe. "Love isn't supposed to come with terms and conditions." She revealed that she'd been fighting with my parents for years about their transactional approach to parenthood. Her own story emerged like pieces of a puzzle I'd never known existed. My great-grandmother Rose's mother had been disowned by her wealthy family for marrying a schoolteacher instead of the banker they'd chosen. History, it seemed, had a cruel way of repeating itself in our bloodline. Rose and I began meeting monthly for lunch, always at restaurants far from Westport to avoid detection. She bought every piece of jewelry I made, insisting on paying full price despite my protests. More importantly, she shared family stories I'd never heard, painting a picture of generations of women who chose love over money and faced the consequences. She gave me her own wedding ring, a simple gold band worn thin by 70 years of marriage to my grandfather, who had died when I was 10. "He was a mailman," she laughed. "My parents nearly died of shame. But we had 57 years of happiness, which is more than your parents have ever managed with all their money." The meetings continued in secret for 6 months before my parents discovered them through their obsessive monitoring of Rose's credit card statements. The confrontation, Rose told me later, was explosive. They threatened to have her declared mentally incompetent, to take control of her finances, to put her in a nursing home. Rose, at 83 years old, and all 5 feet of her, stood up to my 6-foot-tall father and told him exactly where he could stick his threats. "I've lived through the Depression, a world war, and 57 years of your grandfather's snoring," she told him. "You think I'm scared of you?" She continued meeting me despite their escalating threats, even changing her will to ensure I would inherit her modest estate. "It's not much," she warned me, "but it's yours, given freely with love, which is more than those 2 vultures ever offered." 3 months later, Rose died in her sleep. The housekeeper found her peacefully in bed, having gone to sleep reading one of her romance novels. At least that was the official story. The speed with which my parents had her cremated, the refusal to allow an autopsy, and the immediate installation of locks on her house raised questions I couldn't prove, but couldn't ignore. When I tried to attend her funeral, security guards my parents had hired turned me away at the church door. I sat in my car in the parking lot, watching through tears as they buried the only family member who had ever loved me unconditionally, wearing the wedding ring she'd given me as my only connection to her. 2 weeks after Grandmother Rose's funeral, a certified letter arrived at our apartment. My hands shook as I opened it, recognizing the law firm's letterhead from years of watching my father conduct business. But instead of the cease and desist order or lawsuit, I expected it contained news that changed everything. Rose had left me her entire estate in a will updated just 1 month before her death. The inheritance wasn't massive by my parents' standards, but $50,000, and her collection of family heirlooms represented more money than Jake and I had managed to save in 3 years of grinding work. The joy lasted exactly 48 hours before my parents' lawyers descended like vultures on a carcass. They contested the will on grounds of undue influence and mental incompetence, painting me as a manipulative granddaughter who had taken advantage of a confused elderly woman. The legal documents they filed read like fiction written by someone who had never met Rose or witnessed the steel in her spine when she stood up for what she believed in. According to their version of events, I had isolated Rose from her loving son, and daughter-in-law poisoned her mind against them and coerced her into changing her will. Using part of the inheritance I hadn't even received yet as collateral, I hired Bethany Chen, a lawyer recommended by one of Jake's clients who had fought a similar case. Bethany was everything I needed: brilliant, tenacious, and personally familiar with family financial abuse. Our first meeting lasted 4 hours as I laid out the entire twisted history of my relationship with my parents, including the ledgers, the ultimatum, and their systematic isolation of me from the family. Bethany took notes with the focused intensity of someone who recognized patterns. "Your parents are what we call serial litigators," she explained, sliding a folder across her desk. "I've done some research, and this isn't their first rodeo." The folder contained court records showing a string of lawsuits my parents had filed against various family members over the years. My Uncle Thomas, my father's younger brother, had lost a similar case 10 years ago when he'd tried to start his own investment firm instead of joining the family business. The litigation had destroyed his startup capital and his marriage. He now lived in Portland, completely estranged from the family. My cousin Marie's case was even more heartbreaking. She had fought back when my parents sued her for repayment of college tuition after she'd dropped out to care for her sick daughter. She won the case, proving that the tuition had been a gift, not a loan, but the legal bills bankrupted her. She'd had to sell her house and move in with her ex-husband's parents, who thankfully were more supportive than her own family. Bethany had tracked down both Thomas and Marie, who were willing to testify about my parents' pattern of using litigation as a weapon. The first deposition revealed the true depth of my parents' obsession. Richard arrived with banker's boxes full of those leather-bound ledgers, presenting them as evidence of their investment in me. He had calculated everything down to the penny, including the gas money spent driving me to playdates when I was 6. The total, he claimed with a straight face, came to $1.8 million when you included 18 years of compounded interest at market rates. "We're not asking for full repayment," he said magnanimously. "Just the return of assets that were purchased with our money, including gifts from Rose that were only possible because we maintained her lifestyle." Bethany's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. She forced Richard to admit that the ledgers had been started before I was even born, that they had similar books for Thomas and other family members. When she asked about a ledger from 30 years ago with his deceased brother, Michael's name on it, Richard's composure finally cracked. He claimed attorney-client privilege, which made no sense, then said the records had been destroyed in a flood, despite having just testified that he never destroyed financial documents. The revelation that my Uncle Michael had died in a car accident shortly after a similar financial dispute with my parents sent chills down my spine. Bethany subpoenaed the accident report and found irregularities that the initial investigation had missed. The brake line failure that caused Michael's death was attributed to wear and tear, but the mechanic's report showed the car had been serviced just 2 weeks before the accident, at a shop my father had recommended. We couldn't prove murder, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. As the legal battle intensified, my parents' behavior became increasingly erratic. They seemed desperate to get their hands on Rose's belongings, especially items with no monetary value. They filed motion after motion demanding immediate access to her house, claiming they needed to secure family property. The judge denied each request, but their urgency suggested something beyond simple greed. Bethany hired a private investigator named Wayne Drummond to dig deeper into my parents' finances, suspecting their desperation might stem from problems we couldn't see. When legal channels failed to deliver quick results, my parents abandoned any pretense of civilized behavior. The attack started subtly, the way psychological warfare always does. First came the call from the health department claiming they'd received complaints about my jewelry business, operating without proper permits from a residential address. Never mind that I'd filed all necessary paperwork and paid every fee required. The inspector, who showed up clearly uncomfortable with his assignment, admitted off the record that the complaint had come from very persistent people with significant political connections. While I dealt with bureaucratic red tape that shut down my online orders for 3 months, Jake's plumbing business faced its own orchestrated crisis. Contracts he'd held for 2 years suddenly evaporated. The property management company that provided 40% of his revenue called to say they were going in a different direction, despite Jake's perfect service record. When he pressed for an explanation, the manager, someone Jake had worked with since starting his business, broke down and admitted he'd received a call from Richard Lawson himself, threatening to destroy the company if they continued working with that Mexican boy who's corrupting my daughter. The anonymous complaints to the state licensing board came next, alleging substandard work, overcharging, and safety violations. Jake had to spend countless hours responding to baseless accusations, providing documentation for jobs he'd completed perfectly, and submitting to surprise inspections that always conveniently happened during his busiest times. The inspector, after the 4th fruitless visit, pulled Jake aside. "Look, I know this is harassment, but my hands are tied. These people have connections all the way up to the state capitol." But the professional sabotage was just the opening salvo. My parents hired a cybersecurity expert, though I doubt they called him that on the invoice, to hack into our digital lives. Emails between Rose and me started appearing on social media, edited and taken out of context to paint me as a gold-digging manipulator. A sweet message where Rose said she wanted to help with our wedding became evidence that I was pressuring her for money. Her comment that my parents never understood what love meant was twisted to suggest I had turned her against her own son. Local news picked up the story with the kind of sensational headline that drives clicks: "Ungrateful daughter sues parents after abandoning them for boyfriend." The article, clearly fed information by my parents' public relations team, portrayed me as a cautionary tale of privilege squandered. They used my Yale graduation photo next to a picture of me in my bakery uniform, as if working for a living was something shameful. The comment sections filled with vitriol from strangers who felt qualified to judge my entire life based on a biased article and carefully curated misinformation. Death threats started arriving within days. Not vague, angry messages, but specific, detailed threats that mentioned where I worked, what route I took to the bus stop, and what Jake's van looked like. One included a photo of me taken from across the street while I was tutoring a student through a coffee shop window. We filed police reports, but the officers seemed more interested in whether we had considered settling with your parents to make this go away than investigating actual crimes. The pressure on Bethany's law firm intensified as my father leveraged every banking connection he had. Senior partners who had never shown interest in Bethany's cases suddenly demanded detailed updates on our strategy. Her billable hours were questioned, her expense reports scrutinized, and her other cases mysteriously reassigned to junior associates. When she refused to drop my case, they put her on performance review, despite her spotless record. "I'm not backing down," Bethany told me over coffee in a diner far from her office, correctly paranoid about surveillance. My parents disowned me when I came out at 25. I know what it's like to have family choose their image over their child. She revealed that her own inheritance battle had ended with her parents donating her college fund to conversion therapy programs, rather than let their lesbian daughter have a penny. The difference is your parents are sloppy. Their desperation is making them careless. Wayne, our private investigator, had been following the money trails with the dogged determination of someone who'd seen corruption before and took personal satisfaction in exposing it. What he uncovered went beyond family dysfunction into the realm of systematic criminality. Richard had been embezzling from his own investment firm for over 20 years, using a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. But the truly shocking part was how he'd hidden the money trail by using his children's social security numbers and identities. Loans had been taken out in my name when I was a minor used for Richard's trading schemes, then strategically defaulted to create tax advantages. Credit cards I'd never applied for had been maxed out and abandoned, destroying my credit before I was old enough to know what a FICO score was. The same pattern appeared with my deceased Uncle Michael, and even my cousins. We weren't children to Richard and Diane. We were social security numbers to be exploited, identities to be used and discarded when convenient. The realization that Rose's worthless items might contain evidence of these crimes explained my parents' desperate attempts to gain access to her belongings. The birthday cards she'd saved weren't just sentimental. Rose had written notes on them about her suspicions, creating a paper trail of accusations spanning decades. Mr. Buttons, my childhood teddy bear, had spent years in Rose's guest room where she'd noticed its unusual weight. An X-ray revealed a recording device sewn into the stuffing containing hours of conversations between my parents discussing their financial crimes. When my parents realized we were getting close to the truth, subtlety went out the window entirely. Jake was jumped in the parking lot of a job site by two men who broke 3 of his ribs and his left hand while delivering a message. Your girlfriend needs to learn when to quit. I was at the hospital holding his uninjured hand and crying with rage when Bethany called. Her apartment had been ransacked, though nothing valuable was taken except files related to our case. The police, she noted bitterly, seemed very uninterested in investigating. The escalation continued with my car, a used Honda I'd bought with my own money, having its brake lines cut. Only the fact that I always tested the brakes backing out of our steep driveway saved my life. The mechanic who inspected the damage went pale when he showed me the clean cuts in the lines. This wasn't wear and tear, he said. Someone wanted you to crash at highway speeds. We filed for an emergency protective order, which the judge granted, but pieces of paper don't stop people who have already crossed the line into attempted murder. Richard violated the order within 24 hours, showing up at the bakery where I worked with a baseball bat and a face twisted with rage I'd never seen before. He destroyed the front window and was halfway to the kitchen where I was hiding when the police called by terrified customers finally arrived. The sight of Richard Lawson, pillar of the financial community, being led away in handcuffs while screaming about ungrateful daughters and stolen inheritance made the evening news. He was released on bail within 3 hours, of course. Money might not buy happiness, but it certainly rents freedom. The final straw came when Diane attempted to poison me at what was supposed to be a mediation meeting at a neutral restaurant. She suggested we meet without lawyers to discuss this as family, and desperate for any resolution that didn't involve more violence. I agreed. Jake waited in the car despite my protests, unwilling to let me face her alone, but knowing his presence would only escalate things. I should have listened to his concerns when Diane insisted on ordering for both of us, claiming she remembered my favorite dishes. The waitress who saved my life deserves a medal. She noticed Diane adding something to my coffee when she thought no one was looking and had the presence of mind to accidentally spill the entire cup while serving it. As I helped clean up the mess, the waitress whispered urgently, "Don't eat anything. Call the police." Testing later revealed enough sedatives to cause respiratory failure in someone my size. Diane's plan, investigators theorized, was to make it look like I'd overdosed under the stress of the legal battle, a troubled daughter who couldn't handle the consequences of her choices. The attempted poisoning marked a turning point in how authorities viewed our case. What had been dismissed as a family dispute with unfortunate escalations suddenly became an active criminal investigation. Detective Morrison, the lead investigator, had the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much, but hadn't let it make him cynical. "In 30 years of police work," he told me, "I've rarely seen parents go to these lengths. There's something they're desperate to hide." Wayne, our private investigator, had continued digging despite receiving his own threats. What he uncovered made everything else look like a warm-up act. Richard hadn't just embezzled from his firm. He'd built an entire criminal enterprise using his family as unwitting accomplices. The sophisticated scheme went back to when my Uncle Michael was still alive, possibly even earlier. Richard would take out loans and credit cards in his children's names, use them for high-risk investments or personal expenses, then strategically default in ways that maximized tax benefits while destroying our credit. The paper trail was staggering. Loans totaling millions had been taken out in my name starting when I was 2 years old. Business ventures had been registered to my social security number, run into the ground, and bankrupted all while I was still in elementary school. By the time I turned 18, I had a credit history that would make a career criminal blush, all without my knowledge. The same pattern repeated with every child in the family, creating a web of financial devastation hidden beneath the veneer of wealth. But the real shock came when Wayne decoded a pattern in the ledgers. The obsessive expense tracking wasn't just about control, it was cover for the embezzlement. Every dollar supposedly spent on raising me had actually been stolen from the firm, justified in cooked books as family investments. The scheme was brilliant in its audacity. Who would question a wealthy banker spending lavishly on his children? The private schools, designer clothes, and luxury vacations were all paid for with embezzled funds, then meticulously documented as parental expenses we would somehow owe back. Rose had figured it out. Her birthday cards to me over the years contained more than grandmotherly love. They held a coded record of her suspicions. "Remember that truth is more valuable than gold," one said with gold, underlined 3 times the number of the safety deposit box where she'd stored evidence. Another mentioned how bears always protect their cubs, a reference to Mr. Buttons and the recording device hidden inside. She'd spent years gathering proof, knowing that eventually someone would need it. The recording in Mr. Buttons was a goldmine of incrimination. Rose had secretly taped dozens of conversations during family dinners and holidays. In one, Richard explicitly discussed using Michael's identity for a fraudulent loan application, laughing about how his dead brother was still earning his keep. Diane could be heard suggesting they use my social security number for a new scheme, because Renee's credit is already destroyed, might as well maximize the benefit. The casual cruelty of their discussions, treating their children as resources to be exploited, was chilling. More disturbing still were recordings from shortly before Michael's death. He'd discovered the identity theft and confronted Richard, threatening to go to the authorities. Richard's response was calm and measured. "Accidents happen all the time, Michael. Brake lines fail. Steering columns lock. It would be tragic if something happened while you were driving that death trap you call a car." 2 weeks later, Michael was dead, his brake lines having failed on a winding road with no witnesses. The FBI entered the case with the kind of resources my parents couldn't intimidate or buy off. Agent Margaret Sullivan, a financial crimes specialist, had been tracking similar schemes among wealthy families for years. "Your parents aren't unique," she told me during one of many interviews. "There's a whole subset of financial criminals who use their families as cover. They count on shame and family loyalty to keep victims quiet. You're brave for speaking up." The raid on my parents' home was conducted at dawn on a Tuesday, timed to catch them off guard. Federal agents seized computers, files, and those damned ledgers that had documented my costs since birth. They also found things my parents had hidden, even from each other: offshore account records, forged documents, and a suicide note template with my name on it, apparently prepared in case the poisoning had succeeded. The level of premeditation was staggering. Diane broke first. Faced with evidence of her participation in multiple felonies, she tried to flip the narrative once again. According to her lawyer, she was another victim of Richard's manipulation, a battered wife who went along with his schemes out of fear. The performance might have been convincing if not for the recordings where she enthusiastically suggested new ways to exploit her children's identities. Her tears in the interrogation room, Agent Sullivan later told me, seemed more about being caught than any genuine remorse. Richard maintained his arrogance even as the walls closed in. He hired the most expensive defense team money could buy and tried to spin the story as a successful businessman being persecuted by a vengeful daughter. But the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic accountants found millions in stolen funds, identity theft spanning decades, and connections to other financial crimes that made our family drama look quaint by comparison. He'd been under investigation by his own firm for months. Our case just gave them the final pieces they needed. Other victims began emerging from the shadows. Cousins I'd never met came forward with similar stories of identity theft and financial ruin. Business partners revealed how Richard had used their children's information for fraudulent schemes. Even some of his colleagues at the firm admitted they'd suspected something, but had been too afraid of his connections to speak up. The Lawson family crimes became a federal case study in how generational wealth can hide generational abuse. The evidence room for our case looked like a financial crimes museum. Bankers' boxes full of ledgers, hard drives containing decades of fraudulent transactions, recordings that documented criminal conspiracies, and those personal items my parents had been so desperate to retrieve. Each piece told a story of calculated cruelty disguised as parental care. The birthday cards from Rose, annotated with her suspicions, became key evidence. Even Mr. Buttons, my childhood teddy bear, was entered into evidence, his hidden recorder having captured confessions my parents never knew existed. As the criminal case built momentum, our civil case suddenly looked very different. My parents' lawyer, sensing which way the wind was blowing, tried to negotiate a settlement. They were willing to drop all claims to Rose's inheritance if we agreed not to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Bethany actually laughed when she relayed the offer. "They really don't understand that this isn't about money anymore," she said. "It's about justice." The day of our final civil hearing arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, more real. Media attention had exploded once the federal investigation became public, transforming our family dispute into a cautionary tale about wealth privilege and the dark secrets that can hide behind mansion doors. Reporters lined the courthouse steps shouting questions as Jake and I walked past, his hands steady on my back, my grandmother's wedding ring catching the morning light. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. My parents sat at their table looking like catalog models for wealthy dysfunction. Richard wore his most expensive suit, a $20,000 reminder of the wealth he'd accumulated through decades of crime. Diane had chosen pearls and a black dress that suggested mourning for the family she'd helped destroy. Their new lawyer, the fourth since the criminal investigation began, had the haunted look of someone who'd realized too late what he'd signed up for. Judge Harrison, a no-nonsense woman who'd seen every variation of family conflict in her 20 years on the bench, called the hearing to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. My parents' lawyer rose to present their case, still clinging to the narrative that I was an ungrateful daughter, trying to steal from her generous parents. He argued that everything I owned had been purchased with money they'd provided, making it all technically theirs. The mental gymnastics required to maintain this position while federal agents were building a criminal case against his clients would have been amusing if it wasn't so pathetic. Then came the moment that changed everything. The lawyer presented an itemized list of everything my parents claimed ownership of, running to over 200 pages. "Your Honor," he said, "we request that you order the defendant to surrender all items on this list as they were acquired through funds provided by my clients." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow that suggested storms ahead. "All items?" she asked. "Every single item on this comprehensive list?" The lawyer, missing the warning in her tone, confirmed enthusiastically. "Bailiff," Judge Harrison commanded, "please read this list aloud for the court record. Every item." The bailiff, a young man who probably thought his biggest challenge that day would be staying awake, began reading in a clear, steady voice. The first pages seemed reasonable enough, listing furniture, electronics, jewelry, and other valuables. People in the gallery nodded along, some probably thinking my parents had a point. Then the list took a turn into the twilight zone of obsessive control. Item 47, birthday cards from deceased grandmother, estimated value $0. Item 48, childhood teddy bear named Mr. Button's condition, poor value $0. Item 49, diary entries from ages 7 through 18, no monetary value. Item 50, baby teeth collected by Tooth Fairy, value $0. A ripple of discomfort went through the courtroom as the bailiff continued reading items that revealed the depth of my parents' need to control every aspect of my existence. The list grew progressively more disturbing. Item 73, collection of report cards from kindergarten through college, no value. Item 74, DNA samples from childhood medical procedures stored at private facility. Item 75, lock of baby hair from first haircut, value $0. Item 76, recordings of private conversations between defendant and grandmother obtained through surveillance devices. The bailiff's voice began to waver as he realized what he was reading. Gasps echoed through the gallery when he reached items that revealed illegal surveillance. Item 91, GPS tracking data from defendant's vehicles compiled over 5 years. Item 92, copies of defendant's private emails obtained through unauthorized access. Item 93, medical records including gynecological exam results obtained without consent. Even my parents' lawyer seemed to shrink in his chair as the implications of what they'd documented became clear. The truly damning items came near the end of the list. Item 156, recordings from devices hidden in defendant's childhood bedroom containing approximately 3,000 hours of audio. Item 157, financial documents in defendant's name for accounts she never authorized. Item 158, signed loan applications using defendant's forged signature. By this point, several reporters were furiously typing on their phones, and court security had to quiet the increasingly agitated gallery. Judge Harrison let the bailiff read every single item, all 212 of them, each one painting a more complete picture of the surveillance state my parents had created around their children. When he finally finished, his voice hoarse, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The judge turned to my parents' lawyer with the expression that could have frozen hell. "Counselor, are you telling me your clients are claiming ownership of illegally obtained surveillance recordings and fraudulent financial documents?" The lawyer stammered, trying to backtrack, but it was too late. Bethany rose with the controlled energy of a prosecutor who'd just been handed a gift-wrapped conviction. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit into evidence the very items my opposing counsel has so helpfully enumerated. As he's confirmed, these are all in my client's former possession. We can now demonstrate that many were obtained through criminal means, and others contain evidence of federal crimes." What followed was a systematic demolition of my parents' case that was beautiful in its thoroughness. Bethany presented each category of items from the list, explaining how they either proved crimes or demonstrated the abusive control my parents had exercised. The birthday cards from Rose contained her handwritten accusations of financial fraud. The teddy bear held recordings of criminal conspiracies. The surveillance equipment violated multiple federal laws. The forged financial documents were evidence in an ongoing FBI investigation. As Bethany spoke, FBI agent Margaret Sullivan entered the courtroom, her presence causing another stir in the gallery. Judge Harrison acknowledged her with a nod, understanding the implication. This was no longer just a civil matter. It was an active crime scene. My mother's carefully composed face finally cracked, mascara running as she realized how badly they'd miscalculated. Richard maintained his stone-faced expression, but his hands shook as he reached for a glass of water. "Your Honor," Bethany continued, "the defendants have asked this court to order the return of evidence in federal criminal proceedings. They've admitted to possession of illegally obtained materials. They've documented their own crimes with the kind of detail usually reserved for corporate audits. We move for immediate dismissal of all claims and asked the court to refer this matter to federal prosecutors for additional charges related to the surveillance and harassment documented in their own list. My parents' lawyer made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Your Honor, my clients were simply trying to protect their investment in their daughter's upbringing. Perhaps some of their methods were overzealous, but surely the court can understand parents wanting to ensure their sacrifices weren't wasted. The words hung in the air like a bad smell, the final insult of referring to raising a child as an investment that could be wasted. Judge Harrison's response was measured but devastating. Counselor, what I understand is that your clients have treated their daughter not as a child to be loved, but as an asset to be exploited. They've documented crimes most parents couldn't imagine committing. They've pursued this litigation not out of any legitimate claim, but as an attempt to retrieve evidence of their criminal activities. This court has seen enough. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. All claims against me were dismissed with prejudice. The restraining order was made permanent. My parents were ordered to pay all legal fees. Most significantly, she referred the entire matter to federal prosecutors with a recommendation for additional charges based on the evidence presented. The sound of her gavel finalizing the decision was the sound of freedom I'd waited years to hear. But the courtroom drama wasn't quite over. As the bailiff moved to escort my parents out, Diane suddenly broke down completely. Her carefully constructed facade shattered as she screamed that everything was Richard's idea, that she'd been forced to go along, that I was still her daughter, and she loved me. The performance might have been moving if we hadn't all just heard recordings of her enthusiastically planning to use her children's identities for fraud. Richard's exit was different, but equally telling. He stopped at our table, ignoring his lawyer's attempts to pull him away, and looked me in the eye. "You think you've won," he said quietly, "but you've destroyed your family. Everything we built, everything we achieved, gone because you couldn't just play your part." Even facing federal prison, he couldn't see us as anything more than actors in his financial theater. Jake's hand found mine under the table as I realized I felt nothing but pity for the man who'd never understood that children aren't investments to be monetized. The media explosion outside the courthouse was chaos, but Bethany handled it with grace. Her statement was simple and powerful. Today's ruling shows that wealth cannot shield those who prey on their own children. Renee Lawson showed incredible courage in standing up to systematic abuse disguised as parenting. We hope this case encourages other victims of financial family abuse to speak out. As we finally made it to Jake's truck past the shouting reporters and flashing cameras, I felt the weight of 28 years lifting off my shoulders. We sat in the parking lot for a moment, processing what had just happened. Jake lifted my hand, kissing the wedding ring Rose had given me. "She would have been proud," he said. Through my tears, I could almost see Rose's knowing smile, the woman who'd loved me enough to gather evidence for a day she hoped would never come, but prepared for anyway. The federal trial that followed was almost anticlimactic after the drama of the civil case. My parents, faced with mountains of evidence and the prospect of spending their remaining years in prison, finally accepted plea deals. Richard received 25 years for embezzlement, identity theft, tax fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder in Uncle Michael's death. Diane got 15 years for her role in the financial crimes and the attempted poisoning. Neither showed remorse at sentencing, maintaining to the end that they were victims of ungrateful children who didn't appreciate their sacrifices. Watching them led away in handcuffs and orange jumpsuits was surreal. These people who had valued appearance above all else were reduced to federal inmate numbers, their carefully curated images replaced by mugshots that became memes about toxic parenting. Richard's banking career was dissected in business schools as a case study in how privilege can enable decades of unchecked crime. Diane became the subject of true crime podcasts that analyzed how mothers could become predators to their own children. The financial restitution process was complex but cathartic. Federal investigators recovered millions in hidden assets which were distributed among the many victims of my parents' schemes. I received compensation not just for the identity theft, but for the years of lost wages due to their sabotage. More meaningfully, I finally got access to my grandmother Rose's full estate, including family photos and heirlooms my parents had tried to claim. Holding her handwritten recipes and seeing pictures of her young and rebellious choosing love over money connected me to a legacy of women who refused to be bought. 6 months after the trial, Jake and I finally had the wedding we'd dreamed of. Not the society event my mother would have orchestrated, but a small ceremony in the botanical garden where Rose used to take me as a child. Bethany stood as my maid of honor, the warrior who'd fought beside me when blood family failed. Wayne walked me down the aisle, the private investigator who'd become a surrogate father figure. Jake's family, who had embraced me from the beginning despite my toxic background, filled the spaces where my relatives should have been. I wore Rose's simple wedding dress, altered to fit but maintaining its 1940s elegance. Her wedding ring, now resized to fit, my finger felt like armor against the past, and a promise for the future. As Jake and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, I thought about how different this was from the transactional relationships I'd grown up witnessing. We promised to love each other without ledgers, to value partnership over profit, to build a family based on unconditional acceptance, rather than calculated investment. The wedding photos captured joy that couldn't be bought. Jake's parents, immigrants who had worked multiple jobs to give their children opportunities, cried happy tears. His sister Maria, who'd become the sister I'd never had, caught my bouquet with a laugh that echoed through the garden. Even Mr. Buttons made an appearance, carefully preserved as evidence, but returned to me after the trial, now a symbol of survival, rather than surveillance. Building my business back after the sabotage took patience and determination, but Rose Gold Designs eventually thrived beyond what I'd originally imagined. I expanded from jewelry into a full lifestyle brand, focusing on pieces that told stories of resilience and redemption. Each collection donated proceeds to organizations supporting financial abuse survivors. The irony of becoming genuinely successful without my parents' tainted money wasn't lost on me. Everything they'd said I couldn't achieve without them became possible once I was free from their control. Jake's plumbing business also recovered and grew his reputation for honest work, spreading through word of mouth that no amount of my father's interference could stop. He hired other young people from working-class backgrounds, creating opportunities my parents would have sneered at, but that provided real stability and dignity. Watching him mentor his apprentices with patience and respect showed me what healthy leadership looked like, so different from my father's tyrannical management style. A year after the wedding, our daughter was born. We named her Rose, ensuring my grandmother's legacy of choosing love over money would continue. Holding her for the first time, I made silent promises, no ledgers tracking her cost, no conditions on my love, no surveillance disguised as caring. She would grow up knowing her worth couldn't be calculated in dollars, that her value existed simply because she existed. The parenting classes Jake and I took weren't legally required, but personally necessary. I needed to learn how to be a mother without the toxic blueprint my parents had provided. Every instinct had to be examined. Was this normal parental concern or controlling behavior? Was I setting healthy boundaries or building walls? The therapist who ran the classes herself, a survivor of family financial abuse, helped us navigate creating new patterns while honoring our fears about repeating old ones. Therapy in general became a cornerstone of healing. Dr. Martinez, recommended by Bethany, specialized in survivors of what she called golden cage abuse, where privilege masked severe dysfunction. For months, I couldn't even say the word parents without qualifying it with biological or former, distancing myself from the titles they'd forfeited through their choices. Slowly, I learned to process the grief of losing family that had never really existed, mourning the parents I'd deserved rather than the ones I'd gotten. Support groups introduced me to others with similar stories, shattering the isolation my parents had carefully cultivated. There was Marcus, whose surgeon parents had sued him for breach of contract when he became a teacher instead of a doctor. Amy's family had stolen her identity to fund their lifestyle while she lived in poverty. David's inheritance from his grandfather had been invested by his parents into bankruptcy. Together, we formed a chosen family of survivors who understood that DNA didn't determine destiny. The foundation I eventually established, breaking the ledger, provided resources for people escaping financial abuse. We offered legal referrals, identity theft recovery support, and emergency funds for those whose families used money as a weapon. Bethany joined the board, bringing her legal expertise and personal passion. Wayne contributed his investigative skills, helping victims document abuse. Even some of the reporters who'd covered my case donated their time, sharing stories that helped others recognize their own situations. 3 years after the trial, I received a letter from federal prison. My mother's handwriting, still perfect, despite incarceration, spelled out a request for commissary money. She claimed to have found religion, to have realized her mistakes, to want to rebuild our relationship. The manipulation was subtler than before, but still transparent references to her suffering, implications that I owed her forgiveness, hints that good daughters didn't abandon their mothers regardless of circumstances. I thought about responding, maybe even visiting, but Rose's voice echoed in my memory. When people show you who they are, believe them the first time. Instead, I took the ledger my parents had kept of my childhood expenses, the one entered into evidence, and returned after the trial. On the final page, after their calculated total of $1.8 million, I wrote a single line: invoice paid in full, account closed forever. I had Bethany send it through official channels, ensuring they received the only response they'd ever understand, a final accounting that freed me from their balance sheet forever. The last time I saw my parents was in a documentary about financial crimes within wealthy families. Seeing their mugshots alongside their former society photos was jarring but necessary. They looked smaller, somehow stripped of the power that money and manipulation had given them. The interviewer asked if I had any message for them. I thought carefully before responding. I hope they find peace with their choices, but that journey is theirs to make, not mine to fund. Today, my life looks nothing like the one my parents had planned for me. No mansion in Westport, no country club membership, no trust fund to cushion every decision. Instead, I have something worth infinitely more. A partner who loves me without conditions. A daughter who will never doubt her inherent worth. A business built on integrity rather than exploitation, and the freedom to define family by choice rather than chromosomes. Sometimes I still hear echoes of my father's voice, calculating my cost, or my mother's disappointment at my choices. But then I look at the life Jake and I built from nothing but love and determination, at the community we've created, and the people we've helped, and I know the truth. The only thing my parents were right about was that I'd never make it on their terms. Thank heaven for that, because their terms were a prison disguised as privilege, and breaking free was worth every penny they claimed I owed. Rose visits me in dreams, sometimes always smiling, always proud. In those dreams, she never mentions the evidence she gathered or the battles we fought. Instead, she asks about her great-granddaughter, about the jewelry I'm designing, about whether Jake still makes me laugh. She reminds me that the best revenge against those who see love as currency is to love freely, without expectation of return. And when I wake, I hold my daughter closer, kiss my husband deeper, and know that I've already won everything worth winning. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey of survival, justice, and ultimately redemption. If you've experienced family financial abuse or know someone who has, please remember that you're not alone and that DNA doesn't obligate you to accept exploitation. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Have you or someone you know dealt with family members who confused love with ledgers? How did you find the strength to break free? Please take a moment to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe to hear more stories of people who chose their own worth over their family's wealth. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that it's okay to close the account on toxic relationships, even when those relationships come with a genetic connection. Remember, the most valuable inheritance isn't money, but the freedom to live authentically. Until next time, this is Renee reminding you that your worth was never meant to be calculated in a ledger. You were born valuable, no receipts required.